Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for joining us today for our first ever Office Principles webinar. Very warm welcome. I'm Lee Parsons and I'm the Marketing Director at Office Principles. I'm sure you'd all agree that we're living in pretty unprecedented times. Many of us are working from home, myself included, and for many this is a first-time experience. Many people are concerned about their own mental health and also the mental health of their colleagues, partners and employees. I feel that there's never been a more relevant time to talk about managing the well-being and productivity of a remote workforce. I'm shortly going to be handing over to Madeleine Evans. She's the founder and CEO of Levell, a startup that creates tools to help companies manage the well-being and productivity of a remote workforce. If you do have any questions during the webinar, then we will be sending out an email at the end of the webinar. Please reply to the email with your feedback and questions, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. So without further ado, I will now pass over to Madeleine.
Great, thank you so much, Lee. Really happy to be here. Thank you all for joining today. I know we all have incredibly busy schedules, but it's so true that the issue of both mental health and actually productivity are still very top of mind for all of us, especially in the uncertainty of the current business environment, as well as changing conditions to work. Today, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the connections between mental health and productivity, and then talk through some of our key recommendations, as well as a little bit about us. Today, this is a relatively bleak picture of our workforce. 74% of people have experienced acute stress and felt unable to cope. 25% of Gen Y, individuals 16 to 24-year-olds, feel anxious or stressed almost every day. And almost 20% of people have a diagnosable common mental health problem, depression, anxiety. At the same time, we're struggling with productivity. You can see GDP and output has been going up, but the reason has been hours worked, not growth in human capital productivity contribution. These are twin problems, productivity and mental health, currently being addressed by organizations in a bifurcated strategy. I like to call it strategy A and strategy B. Every single organization, we would hope, at least large ones, has a productivity strategy. That might be redundancies to cut costs. It might be changes in the work process. It could be changes to who does what work, insourcing, outsourcing to lower cost jurisdictions, for example. It could be changing how work is done. Is it moving fast and breaking things, going agile, or digital transformation? And it could be task or job automation. But now, thanks to the awareness work that has been done by the UK government, you may be aware of the Stevenson Farmer report, and really that's been on behalf of the NHS, looking at the costs of ill mental health to the NHS through and the impact of the economy. Many organizations are now also considering their approach to workforce mental health and putting in place a mental health strategy. Based on work done by the CIPD, in 2018, just 1 in 6 employers had a defined mental health strategy in place. However, over a third plan to introduce one in the next 12 months and a further quarter by 2020. This suggests that by the end of this year, more than 3/4 of UK companies will have a defined mental health strategy. And wellbeing spending rose, yet it remains relatively low, with a median spend of just £26 to £50 per year per employee, even at organisations with a bit of a wellbeing strategy, often focused on benefits in place. So the question that I have for you today is this bifurcated strategy, strategy A, strategy B, productivity on one hand, mental health on the other. Is this efficient? We're all humans, right? So there must be a way in which these two things link. This is a question that we asked ourselves, that I asked myself myself when I started Levell. Mental health and productivity. These are both huge problems. What if we knew how to tackle both at once? I'm going to show you a couple of slides which help you understand how these two things link at the level of human psychology and physiology. We're drawing here on some core models from academic research and organizational psychology as well. This is a stress performance curve. It shows, also called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It shows how human performance is derived from being under stress, particularly under strain, and how human performance breaks down under burnout. With a bit of stress, there is this short-term boost. This is in terms of ability to execute a task, or if we were humans on the savannah, to fight or run. So we start to perform better on execution tasks here at the beginning of the curve. But when we get to high levels of stress or strain, we start to get into fatigue, exhaustion. This is where we see connections with impact on, for example, task errors, a rise in errors in work. Then, with further strain and stress, we get into stages of anger, anxiety, and panic. This is where we start to see impact on team dynamics, on customer service, on your ability to deliver what your clients want. These connections are all now borne out in decades of occupational psychology research. And of course, towards the very end of burnout and breakdown, the performance is back to zero. Now, this is what I like to call the spectrum of well-being and mental health. And it shows you that well-being is not just a fluffy thing, it's directly connected to diagnosable mental health problems as well. This distribution is based on a survey that Levell has done of the US and UK workforce, corroborated also by other surveys. We can talk a little bit about the percentages. On one hand, you have what we normally hear talk about ill mental health, anxiety, depression, and pain, that 15 to 20% of the people. Levell research shows that approximately 30 to 40% of staff are already in stages of low motivation or moderate burnout. And 60 to 70% of staff are feeling some levels of stress or exhaustion in work. That means less than 30% of people or around 30% of people are actually thriving. Academic research also makes connections between these two stages. They're not different. It's almost an early stage of the later one. People who experience burnout are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience anxiety, depression, pain, and other health problems. And also chronic stress and exhaustion prevent us from being a state of positive mental health and psychological well-being. Here's a little bit of a clincher. I want to show you how the stress response inhibits creativity. This is a graph which comes directly from a paper called The Relationship Between Stressors and Creativity, comparing theoretical models. And we're looking at evaluative, which is kind of pressure-driven stress, someone's watching you, and then uncertainty-driven stress, when you don't know what's going to happen. A lot of what's going on right now with COVID. With a tiny bit of evaluative stress or pressure, we get a little boost in creativity, perhaps a bit more focused. But when we introduce uncertainty, our creativity actually goes below our normal levels. And with greater levels of pressure and uncertainty, our creativity drops again. So we see how psychological well-being and also physical well-being, how we're feeling, are we in stages of strain or are we calm? Are we in stages of exhaustion? Are we energized? Are we feeling motivated? What are our emotions like? It's almost the first port of call, the first signal, and also sort of the root cause between these two problems of, on one hand, low productivity, and that could be from errors in task execution, it could be from lack of creativity, and also ill mental health. So how do we fix this? This is the question that we asked ourselves at Levell. We've got a pretty simple model, and it involves looking at how people are feeling and then going beneath that. Here's what we do. First, identify when people are in pre-burnout or in the stress response. When are your staff feeling exhausted, unhappy, low motivation? Then figure out what it is they're responding to, physically, mentally, emotionally, motivationally, what's causing that? And also, is that on the personal side, or is it related to work? Next step, fix it. Ideally, prioritizing common issues. Clearly, there are boundaries. As an organization, you take responsibility for those things which impact most of your staff that come from organizational, structural level, cultural process, maybe your physical environment, your workplace design. But you can also influence and support the way in which staff are addressing those personal non-issues through your allocation of benefits, for example, or the way in which you organize social events at work. And with fixing it, you're addressing those root cause issues, which are impacting staff levels of productivity, again, execution and creativity aspects, as well as mental health. So the next question is, how do we apply this to our now remote workforce? I pulled out a couple of key, I would say, kind of actionable recommendations or key themes. Number one, check in with your team. This is one of the best ways to engage your remote workforces day to day. Now, the concept of checking in, you've probably heard it before, but it's not just corporate speak. It's actually simple, easy, real, personal, and relevant. This is typically done face-to-face, of course, if you're on site. But when you're off-site, going remote, you can use Zoom, Teams, Skype, WhatsApp video. I'm personally checking in 1 to 3 times daily as a remote direct line manager with every single person that I directly manage today. In terms of connection and engagement, this is perfect, but it's also time consuming. And I'm a bit of an introvert. It can really be draining. So looking at how to complement those face-to-face video-based check-ins with the digital toolkit that will enable you to capture information from those check-ins and scale those insights to make better, more strategic business decisions across your distributed staff is smart as well. Number 2, let your team share what should change. This means facilitating open and honest communication between teams, peers, and managers. Clearly, business expectations have massively changed. We were chatting with a couple of clients the other day, and it's like we're barely getting into a stage where we can kind of plan ahead a week. We were just operating last week on a day-to-day basis. Right? But so has work, and so has life changed. So employee expectations and experiences are also changing. In times like these, they actually need much more voice than they would have had previously. So things like an annual survey or a quarterly survey, or even kind of those closed-ended pulse surveys, they just don't cut it in this environment because things are changing day to day. So what is this about? This means changing your communication style. This means potentially being a lot more open, honest, and direct over communicating relative to how you were before. Probably this also means opening up the opportunity for staff to feedback more in meetings, thinking about pausing after each idea and letting people just contribute what they have so they can ensure to feel included in those decisions. And letting staff contribute their own ideas. So what's been coming up for them as they've been changing, what will help them be most productive. In order to do that, you also need to look at your toolkit. Again, annual and quarterly surveys just don't cut it, neither do closed-ended questions. Do you have what it takes to get and understand, not annually, but daily, what your staff need? Number 3, our next port of call is our overall management approach. So we know that well-being is at the heart of productivity and mental health, but if we cannot manage well-being, then we are running blind. And if we don't do it in a good way, then we don't collect the data that will enable us to make the strategic decisions going forward, both now and when hopefully this crisis is done. All good management should be data-driven. And the other thing I really want to pull out is that well-being management needs to have clear leadership. And it should be at a level where you get influence across the entire organization. Often that means the person who is head of people and culture, that could be directly, that could be the person who has kind of strategic responsibility for that, that may be a COO. In smaller companies, that is very often the owner or the MD. And with that leader setting the tone about how they're operating on a day-to-day basis, how are they taking into account their own well-being, checking in with themselves, making sure they have what they need, getting those right foundations, and actually seeing how that flows through to feeling better about themselves, feeling less anxious, and being more productive, creative, efficient, etc. That really sets the tone, and it role models for staff what you can do. The last thing, number 4, focus on resilience. And I say, what does that mean? So COVID and of course, the overall uncertain environment, the changes to how we're working, it totally changed how we as individuals manage our day-to-day. Now, I'm lucky because with the startup, we've been remote working for a while. We were probably innovators in this area and maybe had to jump a couple of those hurdles earlier than other companies. But as I'm chatting with friends, current prospective clients, we're also hearing how much this is impacting people and the volume of decisions we now have to make about how to set up our home office environment. What do we start our day with? How do we handle managing our inboxes? All those things that normally you don't necessarily think about when you have your peers, your manager, your colleagues right there with you physically in a day-to-day. So on one hand, this has changed staff access to emotional support. It may have introduced uncertainty. It may have limited their access to networked. But also it can have potentially unlocked time and opportunities. So one of the things I've been fascinated by is how long we actually spend commuting, when that's direct to work or in between meetings and things like that during the day. And that's now gone. So there may also be staff who are perhaps they're living alone, they don't have children, they don't no longer commuting, they've killed the commute, and they're actually over-resourced and underutilized. Make sure that you meet every employee with the right level of support, either to help with adaptation or to provide the right level of challenges to help them continue to thrive. In summary, 4 steps for managing well-being and productivity when you're going remote. 1, check in with your team. Make sure that you know how they're doing day to day, and do that ideally in a way which is scalable. Number 2, let your team share what should change, increase levels of voice. Make sure that you're able to get feedback about how they're doing and what is impacting that and what should be changing daily. Number 3, implement a well-being management process. As we saw, of course, we're all managing our businesses, but are we also managing our personal resources and our well-being? And this should come from the top. Role model, take ownership, explain where are you actually managing your well-being well and where are you struggling? Even sharing that type of vulnerability can help. Ideally doing this in a way which enables you to also benchmark changes and gather information about how staff well-being is changing during changing environments, so you can use that and implement it to improve the employee experience later on. And lastly, we said focus on resilience. You may have spent money on on-site benefits, classes, courses, gym memberships, etc. previously. None of that matters now. This is about supporting staff, enabling them to develop those skills that they need for their daily self-management, now that they're not on-site and being managed as much directly, and also potentially to take advantage of the extra time or extra resources to get more challenge and growth. Perhaps a little bit about us and what we can do as the best next step. I'll chat a little bit about the Levell app. We've designed an app specifically to help cater to these recommendations. Perhaps, as I mentioned, with our ongoing remote, taking on self-management, self-directed work, we're a little bit ahead of all of this in developing an approach that helps you manage productivity and well-being. Our app lets you check in, take a quick pulse on staff, how they are feeling, mood, stress, energy, and motivation, and also feedback on blockers, anything that is stopping them from thriving in work. And that could be on the side of personal non-work or also on the work side, so you know what needs to change. You can also capture idea suggestions to help you match ideas that come directly from frontline staff with those issues and ensure that solutions are things that staff want and need. Together, we have a set of 3 dashboards, both at the individual level, so you can see your own levels back. It's kind of a self-reflection, closing the loop. How are things changing? How am I feeling? And also dashboards that we implement at the level of team and organizational leadership. Again, to track averages, spot patterns, and identify common issues and solutions that will support staff. I certainly hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I know that we can't do Q&A today. Please don't hesitate to reach out, respond to Lee's email. We'll follow up as well. If you've got any questions, we'll respond as soon as we can. Thank you.